In this video, I'd like to look at writing formal lab reports, which you might come across as a type of assessment at foundation or undergraduate level. I specifically want to just look at two sections of a formal lab report write-up, the method and the results and discussion. We're going to have a look at what we're aiming for in those sections and also some of the typical problems that people have. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to look at the method section. It's really important with writing to think about who is your audience, who are you writing for, and what is the purpose, because that will affect your content and how you write it. Now, you might think I'm writing this because my tutor set it for me as a piece of coursework and I need to get the mark, which would be honest, but we need to try and kind of imagine a slightly different audience here. We're trying to imagine we're writing for another educated person, but who hasn't done this experiment and doesn't know anything about it yet. So why do we imagine that? I mean, this writing the formal lab report is to really prepare you for in the future when you might be doing a piece of research. You might write up that piece of research, you might get it published, and people, to really understand your results and your findings and the claims you're making, they would want to know how you did it, so they can kind of scrutinize your method to have a look at it from that point of view, to understand your results, but also understand the method, because that then somebody else might want to repeat that research or to do it in a slightly different way. It's adding to that research body and that collective knowledge. So it's really kind of running through and practicing those skills. So you're imagining someone who has not done this lab before and doesn't know anything about it. So you need to write your method in enough detail that another person could repeat the experiment in the same way as you. So thinking of might be specific quantities you use, specific values you had for things, any detail that you need to show how you did it, which might not be the same way as the instructions. It's really important to think about the flow and whether this is logical. Because again, if you're thinking of someone who hasn't done this experiment before, if you keep going kind of backtracking or have big jumps in your explanation, it could make it quite hard for them to follow. You might like to think about, what equipment did you use, how did you set that up, and then what did you do with it as a basic flow. Also think about how can you communicate this as effectively as possible. These aren't notes just for yourself, they're notes for this, imaginary other person. How can you communicate and get your message across as clearly as possible, and so that they will listen to and respect what you're saying? So thinking about, you might want a mixture of text explanation and images, but it's important here to recognise those two need to work together, and primarily the images support the text. You can't have something in the images that you then don't talk about in the text. There has to be connection between the two. And this is a formal lab report, so it has to be written and presented, both text and images, professionally, so that your work has weight. People will take it seriously, they will listen to it. If it looks sloppy, it kind of reflects potentially on the method. Even though the method might have been good, if the way you've done it looks sloppy, someone's not going to take it as seriously. Okay, I'd now like to look at some of the common language mistakes that I see when looking at formal lab reports. The first one is commanding the reader, or using what we call the imperative. So this is if I said to you, stand up, sit down. We often see this kind of commanding language in lab instructions. However, what you're writing is not an instruction. You're not commanding the reader, but rather you're providing a record or an account of what was done. So rather than place the thermometer in the liquid, we would say the thermometer was placed in the liquid. Another issue is using the wrong tense for the experimental procedure. Sometimes people use the present tense. The thermometer the thermometer is put, that would be the present tense, is put somewhere. This would be the wrong tense because we're giving an account of what we did, the procedure we used in the past. Obviously, we should instead put the thermometer was put in the liquid, past simple. Notice I said for the experimental procedure. Actually, the tense is more complex than just saying the methods always uses the past simple. If we're referring the reader to an image or a diagram, that might use the present simple. So figure 1 shows present simple and then what the figure shows. Also, we might, if we're referring to the material and the quality of the material, sometimes we use the present simple, but for the experimental procedure, we use the past simple. Also, a problem can be if the language is inappropriately personal. So you've probably heard generally people say in academic writing not to use we or I. Now, in some fields and for sometimes personal language is used, but it is safest, particularly at this level, to avoid the personal language and to not focus on the I and the we form. Okay, so the next section that I'd like to focus on is the results and the discussion section, because this is such an important part of a formal lab report. So before we start writing, we need to think about what the purpose is. The purpose of this section is to state clearly what you found and help your reader to understand the results. So understand their significance, are they surprising, are they expected, and any limitations. So where may they not be quite accurate, and what problems might there be with the results. So notice the key is that you are guiding the reader to understand your results. You're not leaving the reader to work them out for themselves. That's really important. As you discuss your results, the flow is important. Again, because that's part of clearly communicating, so someone can follow our ideas, is actually presenting them in a way that's easy. It might help you to think of it in terms of these questions. What was found? Was this surprising? Were there any interesting or unexpected results? Were there any possible limitations to these results and any improvements? Now, I've put these as questions. Please don't use them as headings. They're there. I've asked these questions to help guide you. You might not want to answer all of them. Some of them you might not think are relevant to you. They're there to help you with the kinds of questions you might want to answer. You then need to think about how best to communicate these ideas. And again, it's probably a combination of images, whether that's figures, tables, and text. But remember, the two need to go well together, and two need to connect up and be professionally presented. So if you've got tables and figures, you need to have figure 1 and then explain what, give it a title. You also need to refer to it in the text, as shown in figure 1. You can't have the two things going together without connection. You need to draw the table or figure into the text that you have written. And again, thinking about that professional presentation, taking a photograph of your results drawn on a sheet of paper isn't going to look professional. And the presentation is important in terms of our results being taken seriously. So what are some of the common mistakes in the results and discussion? I think firstly, a lack of connection between the text and the images. So not not mentioning the figures and the tables in the text. Another one be a lack of communication with the reader. Sometimes it can feel like the results kind of been dumped there, they've been put there, but you've got the table, you've got the figure, but there isn't that communication. The reader is left to work out what the main finding is. The reader's left to look for anything interesting in those results. The reader isn't given any insight into what might have affected the results. It's really important that you're not just providing the results for the reader to analyse, you're communicating the results. Sometimes, sadly, the way the results are presented might communicate carelessness. So where there are tables or figures that don't provide the units or that aren't carefully labelled, or where there are just mistakes like typos, these little careless mistakes, what could seem like careless mistakes, matter, because again, if we're thinking about this as a preparation for potentially in the future writing up and publishing research, those little details could reduce your credibility of, should we take this person's research seriously? If we can see in the write-up a lack of care, might there have been a lack of care in the experimental process as well? So it's really important to show care in the write-up. There can also be a lack of discussion and analysis. It's really interesting, not only you've got a finding, but to really think in depth and to analyse those findings. Are they similar or different to established knowledge? Are they, having seen the method, what do you know that might have influenced the results? How credible are they? Doesn't matter if you're highlighting what you think some of the problems might have been. Actually, those can be some of the most interesting bits. And if you don't include kind of discussion and analysis, you miss out potential for those marks. Okay, so I hope that has helped you to think about a couple of sections of the formal lab report and possible mistakes that you want to avoid. Formal lab reports are a really good opportunity to develop some of the key skills which will help you if you go on to write research reports. I'd say the two key ideas to remember are to communicate thoughtfully. So this isn't a personal record. The formal lab report is about you communicating what you have done and what you've found. You need to do this thoughtfully in terms of thinking of your audience or your imaginary audience of someone who hasn't done this research and communicating that in the clearest way possible to them. Not speaking down to them, but also not leaving gaps for them to work out or to wonder themselves. And also that importance of the professional presentation. If you want your technical ideas to be taken seriously, the presentation of it also matters, because if you're sloppy in the presentation, how do we know you're not also sloppy in the technical aspects as well? So communicate thoughtfully and present professionally.